The tension hit before the engines even roared to life. Passengers were settling into their seats, adjusting their carry-ons, flipping through magazines. The soft chime of the intercom signaled the final boarding call. Everything was routine, until it wasn't. A boy, small, barely 12, dressed in a navy hoodie and sneakers, sat in one of the plush leather seats in first class. He shifted slightly, looking around in quiet amazement. The seat was bigger than he expected. The air smelled faintly of citrus and leather, and the tray table folded out smoother than anything he'd ever seen. Then came the shadow. "Excuse me, young man." A crisp voice, sharp as broken glass. He looked up. A flight attendant stood over him, arms crossed, brows slightly raised. The name on her tag read L. Spencer. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her posture stiff, but her eyes held something else, something colder. "You sure you're in the right seat?" she asked. The boy blinked, confusion flashing across his face. He quickly pulled the boarding pass from his hoodie pocket, holding it up. "Yes, ma'am. 2A, he said politely. She took the ticket, barely glancing at it before shaking her head. "There's been a mistake. This seat is for first-class passengers only." The words hit him harder than he expected. He sat up straighter. "I am a first-class passenger," he said, a little firmer this time. Spencer sighed, tilting her head slightly. "Where are your parents?" His stomach clenched. "I'm traveling alone," he replied. That was all she needed to hear. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I see," she said, handing back the ticket. "Unfortunately, there must have been an issue with your reservation. You'll need to move to economy." A few passengers glanced up, pretending not to listen. A businessman adjusted his glasses. A woman with red nails scrolled through her phone, her lips pursed slightly. The boy hesitated. "But this is my seat." Spencer exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. "Sir, I'm asking you nicely," she said, her voice lower now. "Let's not make this difficult." A lump formed in his throat. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't being loud. He just wanted to sit where he was supposed to. He looked around, hoping, maybe even begging someone would step in, but no one did. With burning ears and a tightening chest, he reached for his backpack. His hands felt stiff as he grabbed the strap, sliding out of the oversized seat. Spencer didn't offer to help. She simply turned, motioning toward the back of the plane. "Right this way." The boy walked past the rows of first-class passengers, past the man pretending to be focused on a newspaper, past the woman with sunglasses who adjusted them but never spoke, past the silence. His legs felt heavy as he stepped into economy. The seats were smaller, the air smelled different. He slid into an empty row, gripping the armrests, his heart pounding. Then, without thinking, he pulled out his phone and typed a message. "They made me move, said I couldn't sit in first class, but I had my ticket." He stared at the message for a second before hitting send. His phone vibrated almost instantly. "What do you mean they made you move? Who told you that?" His father's response was quick, almost instant, not panicked, just focused. The boy hesitated before replying. "The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake, she wouldn't listen." This time the response took longer. The typing bubble appeared and disappeared a few times before a new message popped up. "What's the flight number?" His fingers trembled slightly as he checked the boarding pass and typed it out. He hit send and stared at the screen, waiting. The reply came almost instantly. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." He exhaled, his grip loosening just slightly. He didn't know exactly what his father meant, but something in those words told him this wasn't over, not even close. Elle Spencer walked back toward the galley, her steps light, almost triumphant. Another problem solved. She had a system. She trusted her instincts, and they had never failed her before. Experience told her who belonged where, and that boy, he didn't. She reached for a stack of drink menus, flipping through them absent-mindedly, but something was off. The air in the cabin had shifted. Passengers weren't just watching their screens anymore. Some whispered, others glanced toward the front of the plane where the boy had walked out of first class just moments ago. Nicole, the younger flight attendant, set down a tray of glasses and hesitated. She had seen the whole thing. "Was there a problem with his ticket?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Spencer scoffed, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve. "Please, you saw him. Do you really think he paid for first class?" Nicole's stomach twisted. She had worked plenty of flights, seen people from all backgrounds in first class, business travelers, influencers, even kids like him. But something about the way Spencer said it made her uneasy. "But you didn't even check the system," Nicole pressed carefully. Spencer waved her hand dismissively. "Trust me, I know when someone's in the wrong section." Nicole bit her lip. choosing her next words wisely. Right, but what if you don't? Before Spencer could respond, the intercom crackled to life. Miss Spencer, please report to the cockpit immediately. Her hand froze mid-reach. That wasn't normal. Flight attendants didn't just get called to the cockpit during service. Something was wrong. Passengers noticed the shift in energy. Spencer straightened her posture, smoothing her uniform before making her way to the front of the plane. The moment she stepped inside the cockpit, the atmosphere changed. Captain Reynolds, a seasoned pilot with graying hair, turned to face her. He wasn't alone. On the small screen of the in-flight phone, a live video feed showed a man sitting in a high-rise office, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His presence alone sent a chill down her spine. Miss Spencer, the man on the screen said, his voice calm, controlled. Do you know who I am? She swallowed hard. No, sir. The captain spoke next, his voice firm. This is Daniel Carter, the owner of this airline. Her breath hitched. You removed his son from first class, the captain continued, his expression unreadable. Without verifying his ticket, without checking the system, without reason. Spencer felt the blood drain from her face. The man on the screen didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger, but his next words made her knees weak. You are going to turn around, walk back to economy, and personally return my son to his seat. A pause. And when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board. The line went dead. For the first time in her career, Elle Spencer felt something she had never felt before. Panic. Elle Spencer stood frozen in the cockpit, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The silence in the small space was suffocating, the weight of the captain's stare pressing down on her like a lead blanket. Well? Captain Reynolds asked, his tone edged with irritation. You heard the man? She swallowed, her throat dry as sandpaper. Her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had handled hundreds of flights, enforced rules, ensured everything ran smoothly. And now, in a matter of minutes, she had lost control. She turned on her heel, stepping out of the cockpit. As she walked back down the aisle, the cabin felt different, smaller, heavier. The passengers weren't watching their screens anymore. They were watching her. Every step toward the economy section felt like a punishment. Her mind raced for an excuse, a way to justify what had happened, but nothing came. There was no way out of this. She reached the curtain separating economy from first class and pulled it aside. There he was. The boy sat by the window, staring out at the sky, his posture still, unreadable. His backpack was tucked neatly under the seat in front of him, his hands resting on his lap. He wasn't crying, he wasn't complaining, he was just sitting there, waiting. The surrounding passengers fell silent as Spencer approached. Some leaned in slightly, sensing something was about to happen. She crouched beside his seat, keeping her voice low. Sir, there's been a misunderstanding, she said, forcing a tight smile. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. The boy blinked, tilting his head slightly. A misunderstanding. Spencer nodded quickly. Yes, there was an error in seating. His gaze didn't waver. But I had my ticket. You saw it, and you still told me to move. The quiet in the surrounding rows became heavier. Spencer felt her face flush. A few passengers exchanged glances. They had all seen what happened earlier. They knew he was right. She clenched her jaw. I may have made a mistake in judgment, she admitted, keeping her voice even, but I'd like to correct it now. Please, come with me. The boy didn't move. He simply studied her, his silence stretching longer than she was comfortable with. Then, with deliberate movements, he pulled out his phone and typed a message. A second later, Spencer's work tablet vibrated in her pocket. She hesitated before pulling it out. A forwarded message from the airline's executive office blinked on the screen. Take your time. Make her understand what she did. Her stomach twisted. The boy looked up at her again, his expression unreadable. I'll go back, he said calmly. But I want to know why you thought I didn't belong here. A murmur rippled through the passengers. Some sat up straighter, others whispered to each other. Spencer's throat tightened. She started, but the words didn't come, because for the first time in her career she had no good answer. Elle Spencer's breath came faster than she wanted it to. The weight of the boy's question, so simple, so direct, pressed down on her like a stone. She had never been the one under scrutiny before. She had always been the one giving orders, making sure everything ran according to plan. But now, standing there, every passenger's gaze drilling into her, she felt like she was the one being evaluated. The boy waited. He didn't press her, didn't demand anything more. He just sat there watching. She cleared her throat, straightening her posture. I misjudged the situation, she finally said, carefully choosing her words. The boy didn't look away. No, he said plainly. You judged me. A ripple of tension moved through the nearby rows. Someone a few seats over shifted uncomfortably. Spencer's hands clenched at her sides. But again she had nothing. She had been so sure she was right when she told him to move. She hadn't even considered checking the system. She had just decided. And now, standing there, the realization of what she had done burned under her skin. The boy sighed, slipping his phone into his hoodie pocket. Without another word, he reached for his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and stood up. The quiet dignity in his movements made the moment feel heavier than if he had shouted. As he stepped into the aisle, Spencer stepped back instinctively. It wasn't that she feared him. It was something else, something she couldn't quite place. The walk back to first class wasn't long, but it felt like the longest walk of her life. The passengers in the front section looked up as the boy returned, some surprised, others quickly looking away, embarrassed that they had witnessed his humiliation and done nothing. He slid into his seat as if nothing had happened, calm, controlled, unfazed. Spencer lingered beside him for a moment, unsure of what to say. If there's anything you need, she said finally, her voice quieter now, please let me know. The boy didn't even look at her. He reached for the in-flight magazine, flipped to a random page, and started reading. Dismissed. Spencer's jaw tightened, and she turned stiffly, walking back toward the galley. Her heart was still hammering, but not from frustration. For the first time, it was something dangerously close to shame. Elle Spencer moved quickly down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor. Her uniform, usually a symbol of control, suddenly felt too tight, too stiff. She reached the galley and exhaled sharply, gripping the counter as if steadying herself against something invisible. The other flight attendants pretended to be busy, but she could feel their stolen glances. Nicole, standing near the drink cart, finally spoke. Well, that was awkward, she murmured. Spencer shot her a sharp look. Not now. Nicole crossed her arms. You embarrassed a kid in front of the whole plane, then got called out for it. Now you're acting like none of it happened. Spencer's jaw clenched. I was following protocol. Nicole let out a dry laugh. No, you weren't. She turned to grab a stack of cups, shaking her head. You saw a kid who didn't look like your usual first-class passenger and decided he didn't belong. That's not protocol. That's bias. Spencer's grip on the counter tightened. I don't need a lecture from you. Nicole shrugged. Maybe not from me, but someone's going to give you one when we land. Before Spencer could snap back, the in-flight phone rang. The sound sent a jolt through her. She knew who it was before she even picked up. She lifted the receiver slowly. This is Spencer. A deep, steady voice filled her ear. This is Daniel Carter. Her throat tightened. You will personally file a full incident report upon landing, he said, his words crisp, emotionless. I expect a detailed explanation of why my son was removed from his seat despite having a valid ticket. Spencer swallowed hard. Yes, sir. You will also ensure that, for the remainder of this flight, my son receives the same service as every other first-class passenger, he continued. Nothing less. Her grip on the phone trembled slightly. Understood. The line went dead. Spencer slowly placed the receiver back onto the hook, her mind racing. She had never felt this kind of pressure before. A simple passenger complaint was one thing. But this? This was career-ending territory. Nicole was still watching her, a knowing expression on her face. Spencer exhaled sharply and straightened her posture. There was still time to salvage this. She just had to make it through the rest of the flight, but for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if that would be enough. Elle Spencer forced herself to move, but each step back toward first class felt heavier than the last. She had spent years making split-second decisions, handling unruly passengers, keeping order in the cabin. But now, for the first time, she was the one under a microscope. The quiet judgment in the air was suffocating. As she reached the first-class section, she took a deep breath, plastering on the same polite expression she had used for years, but she knew it was slipping. The boy sat comfortably in his seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine as if nothing had happened. He hadn't so much as looked in her direction since returning. She hesitated, then took a step closer. Can I offer you something to drink? Her voice was smooth, practiced. The boy turned a page without looking up. A drink? Yes, she said quickly. Anything you'd like. We have sparkling water, fresh juice, tea. He finally glanced at her. You didn't ask me that before. Spencer's breath caught for just a second. When I first sat down, he continued, you didn't greet me like you did the other first-class passengers. You didn't offer me a drink. You just asked for my ticket. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. But the silence around them was thick. The other passengers were listening, some subtly, others openly. He tilted his head slightly. Why? She felt her face heat up. She had spent her whole career controlling situations, ensuring the cabin operated the way she wanted it to. But now, standing here, she was the one on the defensive. I misjudged, she said finally. The words felt foreign coming out of her mouth. The boy studied her for a moment, then gave a small shrug. I'll have a sparkling water. Relieved for the escape, Spencer nodded quickly and turned, making her way to the galley. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for the bottle. Nicole was leaning against the counter, watching her with an unreadable expression. That didn't go well, did it? Spencer shot her a glare. Mind your business, Nicole smirked. It is my business. You humiliated that kid, and now it turns out his dad owns the airline. I'd be sweating too if I were you. Spencer didn't respond. She carefully poured the sparkling water into a glass and walked it back to the boy's seat. She placed it gently on the tray table, hoping that would be the end of it. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. By the way, he said, picking up his phone, I just texted my dad about you. Her stomach twisted. She forced a tight smile. I see. He took a slow sip of his drink, watching her. Yeah, he wasn't happy. Spencer already knew that. She had heard it in Daniel Carter's voice over the phone, but hearing it from the boy himself made her stomach churn even more. I guess we'll see what happens when we land, he added, flipping another page in his magazine. Spencer stiffened, nodded quickly, and hurried back to the galley. She had never wanted a flight to be over so badly in her entire career, but she had a sinking feeling that her problems were only just beginning. Spencer moved swiftly back to the galley, but no matter how fast she walked, she couldn't outrun the sinking feeling in her chest. The quiet hum of the airplane, the clinking of glasses, the murmured conversations, it all felt distant, like white noise drowning under the weight of what was happening. She had always prided herself on control. She controlled the cabin, controlled the service, controlled the order of things. But now she wasn't in control of anything. She reached the galley and gripped the counter, her fingers pressing into the smooth surface. Nicole stood nearby, her arms crossed. You know, Nicole said, tilting her head slightly, if you had just treated him like every other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening right now. Spencer's jaw tightened. I don't need a lecture. Nicole raised an eyebrow. I think you do. Before Spencer could snap back, the in-flight phone buzzed again. The other flight attendants all paused, their eyes darting toward the sound. No one moved to answer it. Nicole smirked slightly. I think that's for you. Spencer swallowed hard before reaching for the receiver. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it to her ear. This is Spencer, she said, trying to steady her voice. A deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. This is Captain Reynolds. Her stomach twisted violently. When we land, you'll be escorted directly to a meeting with airline executives, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mr. Carter has requested a formal review of your conduct on this flight. Spencer felt lightheaded, as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. I understand, she managed to say, though her throat was dry. The pilot paused. I strongly suggest you start thinking about what you're going to say when they ask why you removed a first-class passenger without checking his ticket. A cold sweat broke out at the back of her neck. Yes, Captain, she whispered. The line clicked off. Spencer placed the phone back on the hook, her hands clammy. She had made a serious mistake, one she couldn't take back. And now, she wasn't just dealing with a passenger complaint. She was dealing with the man who owned the sky she was flying in. Spencer sat rigid in her jump seat as the plane made its descent. Every small vibration, every slight movement of the aircraft felt magnified. The usual sounds of landing, seat belts clicking, passengers shifting, blended into a dull hum in her ears. Her mind was racing. A formal review, a meeting with the executives, the owner of the airline personally involved. This wasn't just a bad flight. This was career-ending. She had handled complaints before. She had dealt with difficult passengers, pushy executives, even entitled celebrities. But she had never been in this position where she was the one being judged. She forced herself to take a slow breath. Maybe she could explain. Maybe she could convince them it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew the truth. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, stretching, gathering their belongings. She stayed put, her fingers gripping the edge of her uniform. One by one, the first-class passengers exited, avoiding her gaze. The businessman who had buried himself in a newspaper walked past without a glance. The woman in sunglasses adjusted them but said nothing. And then, the boy stood. He moved calmly, adjusting his hoodie, sliding his backpack onto one shoulder. He looked around as if taking in the moment, this strange, silent tension in the air. Then, for the first time since returning to first class, he looked directly at Spencer. She expected anger, maybe satisfaction, maybe something that would make this easier to dismiss. But all she saw was curiosity, not hatred, not malice, just a quiet question behind his eyes. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Because for the first time in her life, she realized it didn't matter what she said. The damage had already been done. The boy studied her for a beat longer, then gave the smallest nod. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked off the plane. Spencer barely had a moment to process before a uniformed officer stepped into the cabin. "Miss Spencer," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Come with me." The walls of the jet bridge felt tighter than usual, the fluorescent lights above too bright, too exposing. Every step echoed, each one heavier than the last. She was escorted through a quiet hallway, past crew lounges, past the usual airport rush. Then a door opened. Inside, 3 airline executives sat around a sleek glass table. A large screen at the end of the room flickered on, and there he was, Daniel Carter. His presence filled the space, even through a screen. His fingers were interlocked, his expression unreadable. The senior operations manager cleared his throat. "Miss Spencer, you know why you're here." She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. We have flight records, crew reports, passenger statements," he continued. "But we want to hear from you." Spencer's pulse roared in her ears. She had spent years believing she was always right. But now, sitting here, she wasn't sure of anything. Carter leaned forward slightly. "You didn't just make a mistake," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "You made a decision." Spencer felt her hands tighten in her lap. "You looked at my son and decided he didn't belong," Carter continued, "without evidence, without question." A long silence filled the room. She could spin it. Say she was following security protocols, say she was trying to prevent fraud, say she had simply misread the situation. But none of those excuses would hold, because everyone in that room, including herself, knew the truth. She had assumed, and that assumption had cost her everything. Her throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "I was wrong." Carter didn't react. "I should have checked," she continued. "I should have verified before acting. I didn't. I let my assumptions make a decision for me. And I was wrong." For the first time, her voice wasn't calculated, wasn't rehearsed. It was just honest. The executives exchanged glances. Carter studied her, his expression impossible to read. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled. "I'm not here to ruin your career, Miss Spencer," he said finally. "I'm here to see if you understand why this matters." She didn't breathe. "What happens next," he continued, "depends entirely on whether or not you do." The weight of his words settled over her. This wasn't about punishment. This wasn't about policy. This was about who she was when no one was watching. She sat there, the truth staring her in the face. Then, for the first time in years, Elle Spencer didn't think about rules. She thought about the boy, and for the first time, she wondered how many others she had made feel the same way. The meeting wasn't over. The decision hadn't been made. But for the first time, she knew she couldn't walk out of that room as the same person who had walked in. And that realization was the heaviest one of all.